everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hair of the Dogcast. It is myself here, Brad. We're still at SGDQ 2019. Have another wonderful interview today. We've interviewed many men and women on the podcast, but never have we had a robot before as a guest. His keeper, DwangoAC, also joins us. Dwango, apart from protecting speedrunning robots, is an ambassador at TASBot.org. He is also the president of the North Bay Linux Users Group. And the robot itself is known for game-breaking, mind-boggling speedruns you have seen here at Games Done Quick. We are joined by TASBot and the Wizard of Oz himself, DwangoAC.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for stopping in. We were at the Mario block yesterday, and you were looking for a spot, and it is a joy to have Dwango and TASBot sitting next to you. TASBot is a bit of a celebrity around here.
It's amusing because if I walk around, and this is less so than it used to be. It used to be that if I walked around without TASBot, no one had any idea who I was. Now, it's a little bit different. If I walk around without TASBot and I don't say anything, no one knows who I am.
Yeah.
But if you walk around with TASBot, everybody recognizes him, and I've started to develop enough of a following on Twitch that people have started recognizing my voice. So there's that. But
yeah. How long have you been the keeper of the TASBot? Were you there since the Genesis?
So it's an interesting story. We should probably start at the beginning. It's a very good place to start, so the song says.
Yes.
So in the very beginning, there were robots. No. So actually, I'm going to back up a little bit because there's a little bit of backstory here. And the backstory is that in 2002, someone named Morimoto released a video, a WMV file, predating the days of YouTube. And in this video, he demonstrated getting 99 lives, extremely close encounters in Super Mario Bros. 3 with piranha plants, near-death experiences, ridiculous jumping, all kinds of things that seemed completely implausible, and completed the whole game in 11 minutes, which was a pretty good feat. And the problem was that, being before YouTube, it was distributed as a WMV file that just wandered around file share sites.
Yeah.
And
people weren't aware that it was a tool-assisted run.
Well, it had a website at the end, but it was written in Japanese, and the especially English community had no idea what it was, and even people who could translate it still had no idea what it was because it was a very new concept. And it made the Speed Demos Archive folks very, very upset because they saw it as nothing more than a fraud. However, other people like Bizquit, who founded NES Videos, which became TAS Videos, saw it and realized, hey, there's something interesting to be done here.
Sure. And
the community that Bizquit started, which is now run by Delicat at TASvideos.org, is specifically about tool-assisted speedruns with annotation. Because if you're going to play in the Doped Olympics, you should probably say you're in the Doped Olympics, if you will.
Yeah.
And
there should be a Doped Olympics.
I'm staying out of that. But the point is, if you're going to use tools to enhance your play, you should admit to it.
Yeah.
And what happened in that first video was unintentionally, through language barriers and lack of technology, a situation where it wasn't annotated, and it didn't have an annotation saying that it was a tool-assisted speedrun.
Yeah.
The concept wasn't even formed by that point. It was called Super Mario Bros. With an extra S 3 Time Attack. So there was a lot of confusion about that. So we ended up with this community around tool-assisted speedruns that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But the problem was that first emulator was so inaccurate that if you go back and watch that video, it kind of makes you cringe a little bit because even the sound effects aren't being played right.
Yeah.
The emulator was highly inaccurate. It wasn't until computers got a fair bit faster, technology got better, emulation accuracy got better, that we got to the point where it was possible to try to get something to synchronize on a real console. And here's something kind of interesting. In 2009, I believe it was True, in our community, in the TAS Videos community, tried to get something working, and he got it to the point where he could sort of make Mario jump, but he couldn't really get very far.
Yeah.
Outside of the TAS Videos community, a well-known hacker named Jakku magically made a device that was able to get Mario all the way through the first level of Super Mario Bros. 1. He couldn't go any farther than that, but he was the first person that we know of that did a full level. In 2011, someone named Micro500 made a new device that was based on it was based on an Arduino. It was, I believe he called it Micro500's NES bot, and it was a pretty terrifyingly fragile piece of equipment, but it got the job done. It was self-contained, ran off an SD card for the most part, and it worked. It was able to get through Super Mario Bros. 1, the whole game.
Was that ran at Games Done Quick in 2011, right?
So Summer Games Done Quick 2011 was the first appearance of a console verification, which is what we call the process of playing back a tool-assisted speedrun on a real console. It was the first appearance at a GDQ event. And SGDQ 2011 was still very much in the early days. It was still held in, I think it was Essentia's basement. I think something like that. I think it was at Essentia. I can't remember for certain, but
okay.
I think that was when in Salt Lake City. And it was a very interesting experience because he had everything on a breadboard in a shoebox. And it desynced terribly on Wizards and Warriors 3 against the Burger King.
Okay.
We don't know exactly what to call that guy, but so it was a showing. It was interesting, but it was definitely not it was not the modern GDQ experience by any stretch of the imagination. Around 2013, I found the whole concept of Games Done Quick to be fascinating. I'd been making donations at events, and I really wanted to participate because it seemed like a really good cause. Like cancer prevention, that's awesome.
Absolutely.
So I remember I showed up, and well, backing up a little bit, I had this crazy idea of doing a tool-assisted speedrun of something like Super Scribblenauts. Realized that there weren't any tools for it because it was a PC game and it wasn't released on any platforms. Went, maybe I can practice Scribblenauts Unlimited enough to be able to submit a real-time run. Realized very quickly I cannot do precision mouse movements at all. That is not my forte. And then just shrugged and went, well, what if I figure out a way to submit actual tasks from the website to the event? And I started a forum post, and the initial response was mixed.
Yeah, people were pretty wary to have tool-assisted speedruns. The community seemed very divided from the Morimoto video. It's taken a long time to get
and a lot of it was old SDA hands that were like Radix. His answer at the time was, I never watched tasks, I don't want anything to do with them. And that spirit was really out of a time when people were kind of hurt, I guess, for lack of a better term. They didn't feel like there was enough, how do I say this? They just didn't see tool-assisted speedruns as valid. It wasn't human effort, so they didn't have any interest in them.
Yeah.
And that opinion came out very strong. This was back when submissions were done through the SDA forums, and there were a couple of people who said, yeah, that might be interesting, and a couple more that said, get this crap away, what are you talking about? This can't be shown.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the moderators and people with green names, as you will, staff of SDA, decided to give it a chance. They gave us basically half an hour or so and a clean slate to go do what we could do. It was a little bit more Wild West in those days.
Sure.
And we had an opportunity to do anything we wanted, but we really wanted to do console verification. I did. I was really pushing hard.
Yeah.
So I rebuilt off of Micro 500's Instructable the whole device, the breadboard, all the weird connectors, it was pretty nutty. We had to disassemble a controller to steal parts from it. It was a pretty janky build.
So I'm going to pretend that for a second I'm not super intelligent in this stuff. Could you explain, like, I'm 5 just for the listeners, not for me. Okay, it's for me. What's going on inside of our little robot here?
We'll get to that in just a second, I promise.
Okay.
I promise. I want to dive into that, but I don't want to derail you too much, because the big payoff is we had someone in the community come in, it was true, that built a purpose-built device. It was a circuit board that had all the components on it in one place, so it was a lot more reliable. We still had some connectivity issues. It's always the cables that cause us trouble, but we had an actual device, showed up on stage at AGDQ 2014, and demonstrated something pretty insane, which was playing Snake and Pong inside of Super Mario World.
Yes, that is a wonderful video, and yes, very confusing to everybody.
Very confusing. Very confusing even to me. At the time, I had very little knowledge of what was going on. I go back and look at the very first video where I was leading a team at AGDQ 2014. I look young. I look really kind of a little bit nervous. I didn't really have my bearings of how to have everything prepared and ready for a presentation of this size. It was definitely not the right way. Mistakes were made, lessons were learned.
Yeah.
But all that to say, we built a device, and that started a trend of a lot of other devices. There are now half a dozen different replay devices. But the punchline I wanted to get to, you said inside of TASBot. Well, there's only one TASBot. This guy right here. This is the only TASBot. He's a little bit modified, just a little. But he has a variety of replay devices. This particular one happens to be our most recent incarnation. It's a TASTN32 board.
If people don't know, it's partially made out of Legos too.
Yes.
Just to add to the charm.
Yeah, one of the things that we found is that making things modular helps. So we have modular boards we can swap in and out.
That's great.
These are 3D printed cases with Lego studs on the bottom. So we can just attach them whichever board we need at any given time. It works. Gets the job done.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a variety of different replay devices that can go that can be attached to various consoles. In our case, we have a specific need. We want to demonstrate what buttons are being pressed, so we have 2 player controllers that can go off to a console, and on the other side we have 2 ports that head off to what we call visualization boards. They're controllers we replace the buttons with lights, made by Micro 500.
Yeah.
So I've wandered all over the place on a bunch of different topics. I think I should probably pull back, let you ask the questions you want to ask, because there's a lot to unpack. But that's kind of the winding history of how we got to a device that's on stage as a mascot playing games on real hardware.
Yeah, and console verification, it is all being played on the real systems.
Correct.
The controller inputs are going out from there. How do you go about choosing which games you want to play? Is there certain
by what works?
Are there certain doors in some games that allow you to, say, create Pong and Snake out of Mario? How do you go about finding the game and then the exploits, if you'd want to call them that?
So one of the things that's happened through the course of this crazy ride, for lack of a better term,
sure,
is around 2015, I want to say, I ended up on staff at TAS Videos as the ambassador of the site. That's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because I am a little bit more official in my capacity of... sorry, the chair noise.
The little squeaky chairs, yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. The wonderful joys of recording in the field. Sorry, folks.
If you could see the other half where the cameras can't see, it is terrible in here.
It's not that bad. Okay, it's bad.
You don't have to sleep in here.
You can cut that part out. So... around 2015, I became the ambassador for TAS Videos, and that's given me an interesting ability. All of the content on TAS Videos is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 2.0, which basically means that as long as you provide appropriate attribution, you can use it even for commercial work. And that's effectively, in some ways, what's kind of happening here. We are taking tool-assisted speedrun content, we're providing the content at a live event that's raising money. That is a little bit tricky. We're following all of the rules with everything we've done, but it was a lot easier when I became the actual ambassador for the site. I was on staff, made it a little bit more official. And at this point, I would say that the community, whether I want them to or not, has basically made me a benevolent dictator for life.
Yeah.
Despite trying at one point in time to give TASBot to somebody else, it just didn't quite work out right.
Yeah.
But I've wandered off topic a little bit. You had an actual question you wanted an answer to, and I forgot what that question was.
How do you go about choosing which games, and what do you call it, an exploit?
So, as the ambassador of TAS Videos, I have this whole library of content to pick from, but only a small fraction of it can be used on real consoles. And testing
most of it's done through emulation on the website, or
all of it.
All of it.
All of it. I'm the only weirdo that's really doing a lot of console verification. There are a few other people doing it. I can name names, but I don't want to shame. There are some really good people. For instance, Arcombs has done a lot of work around the N64 for Super Mario World A button challenge type stuff, or half A press weirdness that I don't even want to try to understand.
Yeah.
There's a few other people that have done tool-assisted speedrun content on consoles. Total is one of them. But for the most part, the vast majority of what happens is on an emulator by nature. We might want to, at some point, break down what a TAS really is, too.
A tool-assisted speedrun.
Right.
Where you can, frame by frame, go in there and manipulate the game. It's only using the regular controller, the controls of the game, but it is done in such a fashion you can do things that are humanly impossible.
And that's really where the tools to assist humans get interesting. In the beginning, Morimoto was simply playing with an emulator that allowed him to record his button presses in order, back up to an earlier state, And specifically, that emulator only had the ability to play in slow motion. That Fantasia emulator that the very first Super Mario Bros. 3 TAS that made wide appearance was made in, that emulator didn't have what we call frame advance, which was one of the most important tools in our toolbox. Frame advance is what makes a TAS a TAS. It means that you can not only play in slow motion, you can go to the next extreme. You can pause emulation. You can look at anything you want to look at. In memory, you can see exactly what's happening in the CPU down to the individual CPU registers.
Yeah.
You can look in PPU memory. You can see what graphics are there, the graphical processing unit.
Mm-hmm.
You can see what tiles are loaded into memory if you want to for some reason. But more specifically, without getting into any of those advanced tools or any scripting and other crazy stuff you can do with Lua, the basic tool you have is the ability to start recording your inputs, put a line in the sand and say, I want to be able to come back to this point if something goes wrong. And from there on, you can experiment to your heart's content. If you're trying to play a Super Mario Brothers game and you want to jump over a Goomba with the fastest speed possible, you might experiment with, say, trying to jump and land on the front edge of the Goomba to see if you can get more height, for instance.
Yeah.
But what if you die? No big deal. You press a button on your keyboard and restore back to an earlier that earlier save state and try again. To make it easier to not hit the Goomba wrong, you can press a button while paused that advances the game emulation 1 frame. In NTSC games, which is the majority of what we tend to work on,
sure,
that's a 60th of a second, or 16.6 milliseconds. So there's 60 frames per second when there's no lag, in other words, a situation where the game is too busy to ask you for input. And by using frame advance, you can perfectly find the point where you can bounce off that Goomba, gain the most height, the most forward speed, whatever your goal might be.
Complete optimization.
Exactly. And it basically creates a community that will not accept anything less than complete perfection. The expectation is that when you're making a tool-assisted speedrun, first of all, you're going to load a save state a large number of times. We call that a re-record.
Okay.
Number of re-records is an identifier for how much effort you put into backing up and trying new things. If you didn't back up very often and try new things very often, there's a pretty good chance that that task is suboptimal, that
sure,
you didn't route it enough, that you didn't experiment enough. It's not necessarily the end-all be-all. Certainly there's a lot of other things that go into it, but it is a marker. And the real thing that has happened since 2003 to now is that the level of quality expected of a submission is very, very high. Morimoto's run would never be accepted today. It's too suboptimal.
Yeah, absolutely outdated by this point, I'm sure.
Regardless of the emulator that was used, the techniques are not perfect enough. And it's kind of interesting because there's this little bit of human element that you can see in Morimoto's run that's missing now.
Yeah.
When you're so digital and so focused, yes, you can do speed and entertainment trade-offs, but the movement just by nature tends to be a little bit more, what's the right word for it, boxy, static, or less parabolic, I guess. There's less compensation. So sometimes it can actually look almost on the wrong side of the uncanny valley, might be one way to phrase it. And some people don't like watching tool-assisted speedruns because they look too weird.
Yeah, the first time I saw you guys doing anything on GDQ was very confusing to me. I had no concept of what was going on, and it's been fascinating learning more. And Brain Age was another one where you completely took the game apart. TASBot became sentient in there, and so you have the online community. Most of them are running emulation, you said. Do you grab some of the highlights from there and see if you can transmit it to console, or do you already know which ones probably are going to be better?
Some consoles are easier than others. Specifically, we know that the original Nintendo is reasonably reliable. It only has a single clock, which makes things a lot easier. Later in the discussion, I might tell you all kinds of fun stuff about the Super Nintendo and its 2 different clocks that cause us all kinds of fun things to happen on Super Metroid and similar games. But
Donkey Kong Country, I heard that one was a difficult task.
I would like to touch on that at some point because there's a whole story that's never been told.
Okay, we'll get to that then.
So the easiest platforms are the ones that are deterministic. There are some that are too non-deterministic, and we simply can't operate with them. I'll give you an example. In the original Nintendo, if you're using a game like, well, let's pick on Super Mario Bros. 1 again because it's an easy game.
Everyone knows that game.
It's going to ask the controller for input once per frame, every frame that it's not lagging. A lag frame happens when there's not enough processing CPU cycles left on a given frame to ask the player for input. The nice thing, though, is that when it lags, it also doesn't advance RNG, because it's usually lagging because it's trying to draw graphics on the screen. In the case of Super Mario Bros. 1, lag frames are a little bit more predictable. They're not common during normal gameplay. Other games like Super Mario Bros. 3 that have a lot going on, it's really easy to get a lot of enemies on screen and lag.
Yeah.
You want to avoid that because it means
you'll
that
desync and...
Well, no, a lag frame doesn't necessarily guarantee a desync, but what it does mean is that the game is not advancing you forward in the story. It's sitting in the same place, not drawing a new frame because it's too busy trying to draw the previous frame. In other words, a lag frame simply delays you from moving forward. It doesn't draw an update on the screen, for instance. You see this where you have a lot of enemies on screen and suddenly you're moving slower.
Yeah.
That's when you're experiencing lag frames. They're not necessarily named very well in one sense, but it's ultimately a case where it's trying to draw the image on the screen usually, and it just doesn't have enough CPU cycles to complete it on that frame. So it pushes all of that work into the next frame. There's a lot of other technical things that happen with non-maskable interrupts and all kinds of other silly things on how the screen is drawn, but all that you really need to know is that in a lag frame, it does not advance RNG, and it does not ask the player for input. Deterministic behavior is dependent on being able to control that random number generation sequence. And all these original consoles, especially the original Nintendo, the only source of entropy, the only seed of random generation of the pseudo-random number generator is player input. So a lot of people are confused about this when they see a tool-assisted speedrun. Oh, that's fake, you cheated, you hacked it. Well, no, we're playing by the rules of the game.
Yeah.
The rules of the game say, as it was programmed, that if the player does this, the RNG sequence will result in this output, which causes this random result. But if the random result is always the same when you provide it the same input, it's not really random, which is why it's called a pseudo-random number generator. You're seeding it with some source of entropy, of randomness, of outside noise, might be one way to phrase it, and you're using that to try to randomly place Hammer Brothers on the screen, for instance. Which direction the Hammer Brothers face, which direction they walk on the overworld map, those types of things. When we have complete control of the input, we have complete control of those Hammer Brothers, which, trust me, makes Mitch Flower Power really annoyed at us. Because we also have total control over the hands that rise up in Super Mario Bros. 3, for instance.
Yeah, which is a huge killer for all the Mario speedrunners.
Right. In a tool-assisted speedrun, if you see a hand pop up, you back up, you try a different sequence of button presses to force it to seed the random number generation sequence differently, and you make the game not give you a hand.
And there's been a number of times with the tool-assisted speedruns where you guys were able to do something that was thought humanly impossible, and since then, I believe, like with the Mario world record, it was originally not thought that humans would be able to do some of these tricks, but then humans, after enough time and practice, were able to kind of emulate some of that too.
So let's talk about the symbiosis between the two communities, because it's actually a really key thing, and if there was one thing out of this whole podcast I'd like to highlight, it's that there's no longer the same antagonism that once existed. When I submitted that first run on SDA forums in 2013, the antagonism was there because of years of hurt of people who were upset about how task content was sometimes being pawned off as real human input. And in the SDA forums, that was a real problem. They would have runners that were pretending they were really doing it with human skill, augment with tools. And so there was a good reason for a lot of, especially the judges of SDA, to be kind of antagonistic. But we're not at that point anymore. Even Radix has changed his tune. And here's what happened. It's kind of fascinating, but if there was a route of a game on SDA, in other words, if a game had been completed by a human and there was a route through the game, that route was usually used as a reference point for the tool-assisted speedrun for a given game. So if someone had routed, say, Batman or something, the tool-assisted speedrun would often follow that route, and because you have full control over the game, they were able to find glitches, find strategies that allowed them to shorten the duration of the run. The task was published, The real-time running community watched the TAS. They went, hey, that's interesting. How did that glitch happen?
Yeah.
They would often try to do the same trick, glitch, movement, pattern, luck manipulation technique, and in many cases, it's usually with some kind of aid. It's often possible to do these types of tricks in real time.
Yeah.
Even frame perfect ones can be done if you have an audible cue, a visual cue, something you can key off of. You hear a lot of people talk about frame perfect tricks. Well, sometimes those are found just by brute force playing as a human for hours and hours.
Yeah.
But it's often far more efficient to use tool-assisted speedrun techniques, TAS tools, to play the game, find the glitch, perfect it, and see how it can be used as a human. So now what's happening is this cycle where the routing and the techniques of each community cycle back into the next iteration.
Helping each other move forward.
Exactly. And that symbiosis is very, very good to see, especially as it's grown in places like Celeste.
Yeah, I'm excited for the Celeste run later today.
Yeah, more on that later.
More on that later. Let's talk about Donkey Kong Country for a second. You mentioned there was an issue getting that task to work, to function.
That's right. So we're going to dive into the weeds a little bit, but it's not bad. Don't be afraid.
I'm not afraid. Let's go in.
Okay. So you might have noticed that when I held this up earlier, these are network ports. They're not controller ports. There's a reason for that. On this board, we have, and I know this is way far from the camera, but we have
We can do an insert shot and throw it up there, yeah?
That's okay. We have some debug pens. It's not too critical. We have some debug pens to help us analyze it. Basically, this gives us a really nice port that on one end we can have a common connector for the board.
Yeah.
The other end can be whatever console we want to connect to. This TAS-TM32 board in particular is able to use NES, SNES, N64, possibly some other formats in the future.
Yeah.
And is terminated on the other end with the console-specific adapter. So we've just built some cables that way, but the cables are interesting.
Okay.
So these network ports only have 8 wires. A Super Nintendo has 12 buttons on the controller, and that always puzzled me. I remember as a kid looking at my Nintendo controller, original Nintendo, it had 8 buttons on it, but the cable had 7 holes on it. And I was looking at the connector on the controller and looking at how many buttons there were, and I was always confused because I assumed there had to be an individual wire for each button on the controller.
But that's not the case.
It's not the case. It's actually not too complicated to understand how it works. In order to make the cables not be very thick, because you don't want to be hauling around huge cables, they reduced the wire count by using a trick. And it's not that big of a trick. It's pretty common. But it was definitely magic to me when I figured it out. And a lot of people knew this long before I did. But on the controller of a Nintendo, simple console to start with, there's 8 buttons, A, B, up, down, left, right, select, start. On the cable, there's only 5 wires. There's 5 volts and ground. You need that for powering the controller. There's a line called the latch line. Hey, controller, latch. I'm about to ask you what buttons are being pressed. We've predefined an order of buttons. I'm going to ask for them in order. Clock, give me the first button. Is A being pressed? If it is, the serial line, the last of the 5 wires, data travels across that as a high or low voltage, saying, yes, it's pressed, or no, it isn't. In other words, a binary 1 or a binary 0 to indicate whether that button is pressed.
Yes.
Clock, give me the next button. Clock, give me the next button. Repeats that 8 times. So on the original Nintendo, it's able to ask for what buttons are being held down by sending them in serial form. So on the controller itself, you've got individual buttons to every single, individual pads for every single button. Those are all running in parallel to a chip on the controller. The chip on the inside the controller is acting as a SerDes of sorts. It's a parallel to serial. It's a serializer deserializer. It's taking a lot of parallel input of all those buttons that you might be pressing, and it's converting it into a single line of responses when the console asks.
Okay. I understand all of this.
Now, do you, though?
I'm following in a broad sense, yeah.
Not to be judgmental in any way, shape, or form. It can make your brain melt a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
So basically, to say it in summary in a slightly different way, the console asks the controller, hey, what buttons are you pressing? The console and the controller have a predefined order of what what order to send those button presses back in.
Yeah.
And that whole bit, once it's done, gets saved on the console as a single byte in memory, which is why there's 8 buttons, by the way. 8 buttons is the most you can fit in 1 byte of data. Byte being 8 bits, and so way more information than you want to know. But and it actually makes sense if you think about it. A byte is made of 8 bits. Each bit can store an on and off state. You've got 8 buttons on the controller.
Zeros and ones.
The Super Nintendo works exactly the same way with one minor caveat. They added 4 more buttons. They added L and R and X and Y.
Yeah.
There's actually 4 more buttons, but they're not hooked up on the controller.
There's 4 more buttons that are like built into the controller that you can't use?
That's right.
What are these mysterious buttons?
These mysterious buttons that don't actually exist.
This is blowing my mind right now.
Are there because in memory on the console they store the first 8 buttons, in fact pretty much the same order that I described in the NES. They're storing that in memory as the first byte.
Yeah.
In order to fit the rest of the buttons, they're putting them in the second byte. But you have a total of 8 different buttons you could store in that byte, so why waste them?
Yeah.
So rather than doing some funniness in memory of storing half a byte, or a nibble as it's called, I don't make these words up. Rather than trying to do something silly like cramming in a nibble, they just read out all 8. So the controller responds 8 times, even though there's only 4 physical buttons. The other 4 could have been hooked up to something. And in fact, on the light gun and the mouse and some other things, they are used for identifying devices. But in general, they're available for use, which is a key point we're going to get into later.
Okay.
But just put that in the back of your mind. So, fascinatingly, the protocol is really straightforward on these consoles, and it's very similar in some other types of consoles. Earlier consoles used individual wires because they could. In the original Atari 2600, you had 4 directions and a single action button. So they simply ran 5 wires of voltage and a ground line, and that's all that went through the controller cable. You'd just, when you'd press the button, it would complete the contact, it would send that individual line back, and it would read whenever. The read whenever part is surprisingly critical. So on the original Atari, and this will make sense when you think about it.
Okay.
On the original Atari, you held down a button, it closed the circuit or caused voltage to go down the line, or whatever the case may be. I can't remember the logic. It closed that line and just held it there. The console could read it whenever the heck it felt like it, anytime it felt like it. And that was especially true on the Commodore 64, the Atari 2600, pretty much every console that used that type of controller. The other Atari computers, the ZX Spectrum, and television type stuff, all of them use that same type of method.
Okay.
But there's a minor problem with that. How do you know, if you're going to be TASBot here, how do you know when to push the buttons? What's a frame?
Yeah.
So I know I'm a little bit off in the weeds talking about all this, but it's because it's kind of core to understanding how this magic happens. I'm going to pause right here and go way back to an example I should have given at the beginning of the podcast.
Okay.
A couple 100 years ago, there was some very interesting prior art.
We're getting in the past here, folks. Were they doing tool-assisted paintings?
Nope. But you're thinking along the right
Are we talking about pianos? Yeah, because I read a little bit into that. And the pianos that were playing the pre-programmed music.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're a music designer, if you have a big organ, or you've moved on to a piano as things advanced, you have some kind of musical instrument, and you want to play a sequence of notes.
Yeah.
How are you going to do that? Well, you have to have some way to program the sequence of notes you want to play.
I think a good visualization for maybe people who are listening, like the opening to the Donkey Kong Country, when they spin they do the opening music and they're spinning the little rotating thing and they're like hitting the notes.
Well, a music box, as has been known for some odd centuries at this point, is a pretty classic way of doing it. It is repetitive because you simply have a round drum with pegs that stick up to hit a finger that makes a note. So a music box is a classic example of a early player playing instrument, automatically playing instrument. It's hand cranked, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. The source of power doesn't really matter. The point is that someone took the time to take that drum and put the pegs in the right order to play anything from Fur Elise to Happy Birthday.
And that would be variable speed since it is hand cranked. With the pianos, is that a set speed then? Or
well, it really depended on the device. There were a wide variety of different ways of doing it. In the early days, especially with organs, what they would do is blow air through holes. So they would take basically cardboard or sometimes even punched metal and blow air through holes as they passed it over. So they would take.
I am learning so much right now, everybody. This is awesome.
I mean, you would think it doesn't have anything to do with video games, but it's surprising how much prior art there was.
I went to film school. The amount of things that happened before filmmaking was a possibility.
Oh, yeah.
It just goes way back.
And so many awesome, amazing things. But in this case, it was easiest with organs because if you think about it, all they had to do was punch holes in the right places and then pass it over the air slots that blasted into the organ.
Yeah.
And you could just... So programming one of those became an exercise in how do we get this, first of all, to play at a consistent speed. You touched on the hand cranked.
Yeah.
How do you get it to be consistent? How do you get the composition to be right? And it advanced in technique to the point that by 1920, it was widely common to have a player piano at home as I don't know, a toy, I guess is the right way to play it.
Yeah.
To phrase it. Let me try that again. It was very common in 1920 to have a player piano that was at people's homes. They had by that point, a standard method of having a roll. In this case, it was paper with perforations in it that you could play back in a piano at home.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it was driven by foot pedals, not hand cranks because you get tired by the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
They'd standardized on what the notes were, and it was really easy to go to a piano roll store.
You could buy this song.
Yep, you could buy a song. But how did they make the song? So there were two different ways to make it, and this is where it finally gets back to games. Trust me, I'm getting there.
Take your time.
The two ways were you could have a famous performer sit down at a recording piano,
mm-hmm.
and that recording piano would, while the person was playing, would punch perforations in paper. You'd have the performer do that several times until you had a recording that was satisfactory. You'd take that and copy it. Now here's the funny thing. You have to compensate for the speed the paper is going through the machine, because as you get farther down the roll, it shrinks.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking paper off the outside edge. So as you do that, the speed it goes changes. When you have a human record that, it just works because you're recording with the same dilation of time and speed as you'll play it back at. So
mm-hmm.
if you just have a person sit down at a player piano, record on a roll, and then play that back, everything's fine. The other way to do it was to have sheet music that was composed by someone. You're taking a Mozart or a Beethoven or something,
mm-hmm.
and you look at the sheet music and you transcribe it, you transpose it, you author it, whatever word you want to say, you literally punch the holes to match the song.
Mm-hmm.
But now you're doing it completely manually, of one beat at a time. We would call that a frame, but you see where I'm headed here.
Of course.
But you have to compensate for things that humans don't have to worry about. You have to make sure that as you move along the piano roll that you're diluting the time right. So they had tools to assist the creation of these compositions.
Rob the robot. Sorry.
Well, maybe. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Here's where this really all comes together.
Donkey Kong Country.
At some point, someone discovered that a piano had 88 keys, but a human only had 10 fingers. And since it was a player piano, why not just add a little bit of punch to the composition by adding more notes than a human could play?
Yes.
The logical conclusion of that a century and a half, well, more than a century later, is what we call black MIDI. But it's very similar to what you would see in a tool-assisted piano. So basically,
you can hit say like with a controller, you can send the inputs for left and right at the same time. Where
yes, that's exactly right. A human would find that extremely difficult because they deliberately designed the controller pad to not allow that unless it was worn out.
Back to the piano, though. Now I'm curious. So they were able to do chords and different compositions that were humanly impossible to play. I need to listen to some of these things if they sound very unique.
Yes, they are very fascinating. You can find a lot of old recordings on all the classic sites, YouTube, places like that.
I'm going to look into this.
There was I can't remember his first name, Conlon, I think was his name. One particular composer took this concept to an extreme and made compositions specifically for a player piano. Not just taking a Mozart piece or a Beethoven piece and adding extra kick by adding another set of chords to provide a deeper sound, literally composing music that was intended to be impossible for a human to play.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating to me because we're all doing the same thing 100 years later.
The human composition websites were very mad at them, and then there was a symbiosis later on.
I would say there was a little bit of... At that time in the 1920s, it's hard to really know culturally because I wasn't there. But certainly there was a wide enough variety of people who had player pianos at home. It's not going to be every home. That was really kind of an expensive device. But it was common enough, especially on the upper class.
Let's get back to the Super Nintendo controller, though, and the fact that they have 4 extra buttons that aren't being used most of the time. And getting back to Donkey Kong Country, there was some of the multiple inputs were the issues for that game.
Now we're getting back into some intrigue. So, if you have a total of 16 buttons, normally you would, unless you modified your controller or basically in general, you're not as a human going to be pressing those buttons, but the controller had it built in. It was not. We're not modifying anything on the console to do this.
Yeah.
So we're in some ways acting like an evil maid. We're connecting to a controller port, and we don't have the best intentions, right? If you have a maid at your house, and you leave your computer open, and your evil maid plugs a keylogger into your USB port, that's the idea. Well, we're acting as an evil maid to the console. We are plugging into a controller port. We look completely innocent until we start twiddling with the console in very fun ways. So one of the fun ways we can twiddle...
Continue.
One of the fun ways we can twiddle is by making the combination of button presses we send mean something. So I'm actually going to go back to Super Mario Brothers 3 for a second.
Okay.
Because this will probably make things be a little bit more sensible. In Super Mario Brothers 3, there is a glitch, and I won't get into the details of that just yet, maybe later. There's a glitch we can trigger to force it to read the values in memory where the controllers are stored as code. The interesting thing about...
You're coding the game.
Well, bear with me. Everything in memory can be executed because the processors that were built for this, the 6500 series processors, were very simple. They didn't have memory protection. Everything was executable. Anything in memory, if you could get what's called basically the pointer, what's being executed right now, if you can get that to point at something you can control, you can make it run it. So... I won't get into the details. There's a variety of ways in Super Mario Bros. 3 to make this happen. But one of the classic ways is what's called the game end glitch. And effectively, we force it through a series of really crazy things to jump to where the controller values are stored in memory. And it starts executing whatever it finds. And whatever it finds isn't necessarily all safe, so we kind of have to be a little bit careful. But in this particular glitch, what happens is it's executing memory, and it gets to a byte in memory, I think it's hexadecimal 20, that says when you hit this value, it's a jump instruction. So when you get to this point and you see this value, it means, hey, processor, you're about to jump to a new location. The address you're going to jump to follows this byte. So we hit that jump to, and the bytes that follow are the two bytes that were stored in the controller, player 1's controller and player 2's controller.
Yes.
And we're able to set those to anything we like. We can just set random combinations of up, down, A, B, select, start, whatever we want, to map to exact bytes that say, that have the value of an address we want to jump to. So we literally force it to say, jump to the end credits.
Yeah.
We tell the game to go jump to execute the area of memory of ROM of the game that is the end credit sequence.
Because that was the first thing you were thinking about doing with Mario, but then why not do something a little crazier?
Well, if you can jump to that, why not do something even nuttier?
Well, then you're going and making Pong out of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't meant to happen.
So
you can't just jump to Pong in Mario.
Rather than jumping to the end credits, what if you could jump to something else, like, oh, I don't know, where the shells on screen are stored, which fortunately in Super Mario Bros. 3 specifically is all congruent. There, you know how you can have multiple Koopa shells on screen.
Mm-hmm.
Their current location and their last location is interestingly stored in separate places in memory, but it's all next to each other. So one of the ways we were able to take over the console was by using this initial glitch that forced it to read the controllers as something to execute, use that to tell it to go run the sequence of bytes that is the location of the shells on screen. Think about that one for a second. Basically, anytime we have the ability to manipulate memory in some way, it gives us an opening.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't necessarily mean we can always execute on it, that we can always take advantage of it, but it's something that gives us an opportunity to potentially have an entry point to take over. And in this case, there were enough shell locations that we could make a pretty complicated sequence. And the sequence basically says, right now, read what buttons are in the controller, store them in memory, move to the next memory location, read the controller again, and store it in memory. And repeat this many times, or until a certain thing happens. At the end, it goes back and executes what we just wrote by pressing buttons on the controller. That's called bootstrapping our way into total control. That allows us at that point to make more sophisticated methods to read from the controller and start storing data in memory and executing it. And we can at that point do whatever we like with the console. And we've done some really, really strange things.
The task block is always one of the most exciting things when Games Done Quick comes around, because I can never fathom what you guys are about to do.
I can't fathom what I'm about to do half the time, and I'm the one leading it.
Yeah.
I can say that the arbitrary code executions are not always popular. One of the reasons are that it becomes a question of, well, what are we even doing anymore? You've now reached a point where you're not really playing Mario, for instance. You're turning it into what silliness have we done? A playground, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
One of the early exploits we did with Super Mario Bros. 3 that was well received in 2016 was a case where we took over the console and then used assets inside of the game to create our own story. We made it look like there was a Color a Dinosaur game hidden inside of Super Mario Bros. 3 or a full shell prompt.
This is crazy stuff that they're doing. This is amazing.
Yes, it is. And it's at a level where I can't even fathom. I understand enough to be able to describe, oh, well, we jumped to memory and we did these things. There are geniuses behind this that understand in depth exactly how to write the assembly language that these processors run on, these consoles run on. And that's actually a key minor divergence for just a second. There's no way for one person to do all that we do here with TASBot stuff. I need someone to physically make a board. I need someone to write the code that runs on the chip on the board. I need someone to write the communication between a computer and that board.
Mm-hmm.
I need someone to write the payload that runs on the console, which we were just talking about.
There's a whole team that's helping out here.
Usually. Oftentimes we need graphic artists. Sometimes we need composers. Sometimes we need people to write, chat tools, but more on that later. This might not be a single episode.
This is the first of a 200-part series. Back to Donkey Kong Country, though.
Yes, so with all that set up, and it took a lot, but the reason is we had to build up the foundations of all we were doing to get to this point.
I'm fascinated. I've learned so much.
And there's one more wrinkle.
There's another wrinkle,
There's
folks.
another wrinkle.
Get ready for the wrinkle.
And it's a really frustrating wrinkle. So
this is not a good wrinkle, folks. Look
no,
out.
This is a bad wrinkle. But I'll explain what happens.
Okay.
So in Donkey Kong Country 2 especially, a very talented, very, very talented guy named P4+2 found an unknown at that time glitch. And this is still under the radar because this has not actually been released on TAS videos yet. But he found a glitch in...
Exclusive.
Yeah. And several years old and not yet fully brought to fruition. But
Okay, the glitch.
one sec.
Everyone needs to go watch every TAS video if they haven't yet.
Every? That's a lot. I would watch the ones
Start
that
with the
are
Games Done Quick ones, and the RPG Limit Break Final Fantasy one was amazing too.
That one was good because we finally had enough time to actually explain stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah. So
Instead of a game like Monkey Ball where everything happens so fast that
yeah.
there's not even time for people to cheer. Because you're already 2 levels ahead of when they were supposed to start.
Yeah, I know. That happens all the time.
So a frustrating wrinkle, yes.
I'm going to specifically talk about Donkey Kong Country 2. So we can get a certain point into the game, get to a specific spot, and do one of these triggers where we force the game to execute what's in the controllers as code. But we found a lot of inconsistency. Sometimes it would work and we could get to the end credits. Specifically, we were testing the end credits.
Yeah.
Other times, it would crash in all kinds of weird ways. Sometimes we would even see the copy protection screen. Oh, you've done something to modify the hardware. This isn't allowed.
Yeah.
Which happens if you have voltages in the wrong place in the cartridge pens and some silly stuff like that. But we managed to accidentally fall into that code. Rather than getting where we wanted to go, we landed there instead on accident, which was kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
That'll be episode 7. Stay tuned for that one.
Oh, man. How are we going to keep doing these? So that one was a wrinkle because we wanted to understand why it was not deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
Remember how I said earlier that the reason we can do this at all is because the only source of randomness is player input. The only source of what we call entropy is what buttons you're pressing. One sec. I've got to really clear my throat.
So is there an element of randomness in Donkey Kong Country that is not from the humans? Is it from the Kremlings?
So it took us a long time to figure out what was going on, and a lot of investigating how the Super Nintendo hardware worked.
Mm-hmm.
And the wrinkle, and this is a pretty significant one, is that there's actually 2 processors in the Super Nintendo. So a little bit in the technical weeds, but it's actually fairly followable.
Okay.
The Super Nintendo specifically, has a 21 megahertz quartz crystal driving the main CPU. It's just a little can you'll see it oscillates at a very specific frequency and allows you to get really tight, jitter-free performance because you don't want your main CPU clock to run at random speeds. You want it to be very consistently running at the same speed so that the game is fluid. So they use a really good part for that. The soundboard on the Super Nintendo, unlike the Nintendo, the soundboard is separate. It's a daughter board, or a separate chip, really. It's running on a ceramic oscillator at 24.576 megahertz. It's a completely separate sound processor. If it's a little bit jittery, it doesn't really matter. Who cares if your C note is imperceptibly flat or sharp?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't really matter all that much. But it does matter for us because there's the minor problem of how you get data between those two. So if you think about how a Super Nintendo is built, you have a cartridge. On that cartridge is the game ROM, the read-only memory, the game code. And that includes all the music and graphics. Those need to be transferred to the console to play it.
Mm-hmm.
The graphics go to the main CPU, to the PPU, the graphics processing unit, basically. The PPU, picture processing unit? Anyway, I always forget what that acronym stands for. But the sound has to go off to a separate chip. So what happens is it reads the data out of the ROM on the cartridge, sends it through the main CPU, and then the CPU sends it off on a data transfer bus to the sound processor. Sounds good so far. Offloading work, no big deal. The problem is the sound processor has to finish accepting that and processing it before it sends a signal back saying, hey, I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of games on the Super Nintendo will not proceed until that hey, I'm done message comes back. But because that processor is jittery, that sound processor is not on a very tight clock, sometimes that message happens the next frame.
Just one frame difference, yes.
Means that when we press our buttons, they're happening on the wrong frame. The pseudo-random number generation sequence is seeded by something different.
Yeah.
And you get what's called non-deterministic behavior, randomness. You get a result where you run it twice in a row and you don't get the same result.
Yeah.
And that is a killer, especially if it's consistently inconsistent, if that makes sense.
But the oscillator is in the console, you said? So why is it that some games are fine going through that process and others are not?
Well, a game like Super Mario only loads sounds in a place where it's not bothering to ask the controller for input at all anyway. They were already lag frames, so it doesn't particularly matter. And there's enough of them that it doesn't even affect. A game like Super Metroid, on the other hand, is shoving audio data through at the edge of almost every door transition because it's unloading the enemies from the previous door and loading new ones in.
Mm-hmm.
And while that sound transfer is happening, it's also accepting player input. And it could take that sound processor a random amount of time to complete all that data transfer. So then you get one clock cycle too far over the line. The what's called non-maskable interrupt to say draw the screen happens, and you end up on the other side of that frame, which means you end up on the other side of your RNG seed that should have worked. You get randomness that doesn't match what we expect, and suddenly you're watching TASBot have Samus derp into a wall. Happens all the time.
Yeah.
So the question is, what do we do about it? And it's actually more substantial to speedrunners than they think. These ceramic oscillators were never really reliable even when they were brand new, because they would be different over temperature changes. So when you had your console cold versus when it was hot, it might run at a slightly different speed. It's not a big deal for the most part, but it absolutely affects games. If you are expecting a predictable pattern, if you're at a point where you have frame precision, if this happens, even as a real-time runner, you're going to see a different result. But here's the tricky bit. We're talking about a console that came out in 1991, or earlier in Japan. These parts are 25 plus years old.
Mm-hmm.
They are degrading. They are degrading bad. Some consoles are so out of sync you can actually audibly hear flat notes. Not many. Most are not that degraded, but it's out there.
That's interesting.
So now you end up with some interesting questions. What do you do about equipment that was built, in some cases, before speedrunners who are using them were even born?
Yeah.
That isn't being made anymore. These chips are ancient. They're not manufactured. You can't rebuild them.
What are we going to do, Dwango?
Well, some parts that are prone to failure are easier to replace, specifically capacitors.
Mm-hmm.
Those are widely known to wear out. They have electrolytic fluid in them that tends to dry out. And
but not these ceramic oscillators.
They're a little harder to replace.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just soldering on a board. We do have new parts that can be subbed in. It's okay. That's still possible.
Mm-hmm.
As long as the main components don't die, we can probably maintain these for quite some time. But we're facing an end date. And a lot of people ask me, well, why do you do this? Why do you show these on video? Why do you bother doing this on the hardware? Well, because I'm the last generation that can. If we don't do this now and preserve our digital heritage, we're going to lose the opportunity.
What are your thoughts on the newer Ultra HD new versions of the Super Nintendo consoles, like the Super
They're
NT
emulators,
or whatever?
so they're nice.
That's just emulator. That's not original.
Well, you could say that at best you could call it a hardware clone. Say the analog Super NT, for instance.
Yeah.
That's probably the gold standard right now. They did the same types of things that anyone would have to do in this situation. They looked at the field, went, we can't get these parts anymore, specifically for things like how the PPU parts, for instance, or the original CPU that was used. They aren't manufactured.
Yeah.
So those actual chips are kind of hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're very reliable. They're not likely to all die completely. We'll probably be able to keep some of these consoles going for quite some time, but there are parts that are degrading. So they looked at this and went, okay, we want to make the most accurate Super Nintendo we can. How do we do that with the equipment we have today? They used an FPGA, a field programmable gate array, to write in logic that matches what should happen on console. Our little clock friend here is solved in a very different way. They used what's called a PLL, a phase lock loop. So they have a kind of a derived timing type thing where they have multiple clocks all over the place driving all kinds of different things. And that's way off in the technical weeds.
1 second here, Dwango. We're at about an hour, and I know you have 4 runs today. I'm happy to keep talking. I want to make sure you don't need to be anywhere. Okay.
We're good. So all that whole thing, just to tie that whole conversation off, what they did is they implemented something on a chip using effectively software. You could almost think of it like firmware-ish, but you're programming a chip to operate in a given way, which means you're using a software solution to emulate the original way of doing things. It's okay, but it's not necessarily completely accurate. And every time you use a new emulator, a new recreated console like the SNES Mini, NES Mini, you're going to have some trade-offs. Some of those trade-offs are very acceptable. Others are a little bit more rough. Like the NES Mini was, the NES Classic was not a really accurate product.
Yeah.
Had some issues.
Well, back to the Donkey Kong Country thing, though. So the oscillator was throwing off the frames.
Yes.
And did it take you a while to figure this out? Were you guys hitting your heads against the wall?
There was a lot of frustration, yes. That was prior to AGDQ 2017, our most technically complex of anything we've ever done. whatever you want to call it, stunt, I guess.
Okay.
Art piece. I really consider this art. We're basically making performance art.
I would agree.
Yeah. It was the most technically complex thing we've ever done. We did have to sub in Link to the Past because we couldn't we could not get Donkey Kong to be consistent.
Mm-hmm.
And even Link to the Past was random. It would sometimes not quite line up right because of the same problem. So how do we solve it? Well, the answer is a little bit tricky. We could put a single clock, replace the two parts, put a single clock, divide them in some way, and have them reference locked against each other. That helps, but even a small jitter, even a 1 part per billion is enough to throw things off. So then we're talking about, well, okay, to get consistency, we can intercept the signal that's coming from the sound processor back to the CPU and tell the CPU it's always done at the same time. That'll give us some amount of consistency. But then we might trash the sound. So there's always trade-offs when we're talking about how to do console verification.
Yeah.
At a certain point, you just realize there are some things that are always too random. And just yesterday, we tested a Famicom disk system, which was a floppy drive. We tested a game named Itaki. It happens to be a tool-assisted speedrun that I wrote, I authored. And I really wanted to see this work on real hardware. It's never going to happen. The reason makes sense when you think about it. It reads the controllers at the same time it's also spinning the disk and reading data off of that floppy disk, effectively, which means that the spindle rotation speed, read errors while reading that magnetic media, those all add up to randomness, entropy, that we can't control.
So with the Super Monkey Ball task that you did, was that last year? Was it last AGDQ? It was recent.
It was Harvey Relief done quick, and then AGDQ 2018.
Yeah. So I know that with task running a disk-based system, there's a lot of variables with the processing with the disk. Is that why you had to do replays?
That's exactly why we had to do replays then, and why we're doing replays again with SGDQ 2019.
So let's talk about the 4 games you're running today. It's very rare that I get to ask someone about the run that they're going to do, and we already know what's going to happen. Hopefully. What games are we running today?
So today there's 3 main games in our main block, and then another interview section I'll get to later. There's Tetris, which, dirty little secret.
Dirty little secret. Oh, I love Tetris.
They're old. They're old runs. We're showing runs today that were made in 2010 and have not been improved since, because it's not easy to improve them.
Yeah.
And that is something that's interesting about TAS, is you get to a point where you literally can't push the hardware game code any farther.
There's nothing wrong with an old TAS. I don't think you're still going to be educating folks today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's stuff that they've never seen before.
And Tetris is really hot right now with Tetris Effect and Tetris 99, so people will be excited.
Yeah. So it's the original NES Tetris, which has its own known limitations. We're showing a Mode B play around. On Mode B, fastest to 99999, or how many 9s there are. I think 6. And we're also showing a play around that draws fun things. But the reality, all that stuff, it's already been seen. Just not by this type of audience.
I guarantee people are going to be clapping and screaming. I will be in the front row. So we're doing Tetris, and then we're also doing Mario Kart.
Mario Kart Wii. And just like Super Monkey Ball, the trick there is we use the Dolphin emulator. Okay. Dolphin is an emulator for GameCube and Wii on PC. We use the Dolphin emulator to play the game with all the task tools that we've talked about today. And if you go back earlier in this week, I actually showed it on stream at AGDQ 2019. It's the Punch-Out Wii segment, directly before Punch-Out Wii segment where Zellard 1 played with a blindfold on. We did an interview section showing how he had to be frame perfect in order to get what he needed.
You did an interview with Games Done Quick here, or is that...
That was at the interview desk here at Games Done Quick.
I have to check that out now. That'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah, we do those interview segments every once in a while. It's kind of fun. We had 3 planned. One of the games we had was cut, so it's okay. Not a big deal. That's all right. We'll be doing one more of those with Majora's Mask late tonight.
Majora's Mask.
Yes. So another interview desk segment, and it gives us an opportunity to show what a level of human skill was necessary. In the case of Punch-Out Wii, what we demonstrated is if he wants to get a star and...
He has that certain
there's
frame.
There's one frame. He can avoid getting hit.
He got the star.
Yeah.
More often than not.
Yeah, he's that good.
Yeah.
He's really insane.
It's great that you're working with all of these big-name speedrunners, too, and that like you guys are helping each other. That symbiosis you mentioned.
Yes.
It's fueling the community in such a good way.
Yeah, and I think it's really positive, especially when there is one minor dirty aspect to this. At a certain point, tool-assisted speedruns hit a breaking point where you cannot push the software any farther. There's just simply no more bugs to be exploited. We'll
just go to a different game and do another one then.
Yeah, pretty much. But even that's starting to wear out. So the rate of new games being released, new tool-assisted speedruns being released of games is slowing down. But more specifically, the rate of finding glitches in popular old games is really slowing down.
We're finding them all.
We're finding them all. We found an 8-frame improvement. 8 frames, and that was a huge deal. That was a very, very big deal that we managed to improve the Super Mario World credits warp TAS by only 8 frames. And it was one of the biggest things that happened all year.
Yeah. So we're doing Mario Kart Wii, and that'll be replays.
That'll be replay files.
So you create it on the Dolphin emulator, and then you play the replays on the console.
That's correct. So we transfer the save data over and then play it back on the real console with vanilla disk, by the way. The only concession we're doing, we're applying effectively a Game Genie action replay style code to enable music or enable audio, sound effects. Without that, interestingly, Mario Kart Wii doesn't actually play the sound effects of the character when you're watching a Ghost replay. We don't really know why Nintendo didn't do that, but we do for quality of life. I'll call it a cosmetic change.
It's like when you watch a science fiction film, you wouldn't hear anything in outer space, but everyone expects to hear it.
Everyone expects to hear it, yes, it's like that. So we do go in and enable audio, and we also add a speedometer in the corner. Again, cosmetic changes only, just quality of life. So those are running on a real original vanilla disc. Console's fine, we're not mucking with how the game works other than those cosmetic changes. And it's very impressive what these guys have done. Their individual levels have been worked on over and over and over again. There are 17 different TAS authors represented in this block.
Excellent.
For 16 minutes of content.
So we're so excited for this one now, too. And then you have Majora's Mask.
That one's last. Ignore Majora's Mask. The next one that's really good is Celeste. And it's not just Celeste.
Yeah.
It's Celeste All Red Berries after a full year of people having their hands on the game, finding new glitches, especially demo dashing, which is a specific new technique that allows for insane mechanics. And we talk a lot about re-records. Some games, the re-record count gets into the millions, and I think this might be the case. They're looking at it in terms of how many hours they've spent, and by their estimate, they've put 20,000 hours into tassing Celeste.
It's quite a few.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
And the results show. It's a very
20,000 hours to get it down to how much time?
I'll describe it this way. It's less than 45 minutes. We do make some speed and entertainment trade-offs that you'll see if you go back and watch this run. Specifically, keep an eye on how many red berries there are following us.
Okay.
But by the way, I said us just there. A little bit of a challenge. Attribution is always a big deal. You'll hear me try very hard.
And you are the ambassador for the TAS community. So
yes.
Yeah, it is us. It is the community.
Yes.
It is not just you, and it's not just this beautiful little robot, but you two are the figureheads.
It is weird being kind of a quasi-benevolent dictator for life and keeper of the mascot at the same time. And
you sat down next to us for maybe 20 minutes. The amount of selfies that were being taken, there was a lot.
They were interested in TASBot, not me.
Well, I was initially interested in TASBot, and you are just blowing my mind with everything you're telling me right now. So,
well, the downside, of course, is I'm telling it to you all in the completely wrong order, but I hope you can cope.
I think it's been super great and educational. But it's nice having a mascot, this cute little Rob the robot, that it gives something people can focus on, and just having him sit up there for a TAS run, it kind of shows that it is not a regular human speed run, and it's draws people in.
Yeah.
He's great. And there's a whole mythos around him. He has his own Twitter account. It's great. Yes. It's great looking through that.
Well, sometimes.
Yeah. And then, so Celeste, we have all berries, and then we're going to have Majora's Mask.
That's another interview desk exactly like what I described for Punch-Out Wii.
Okay.
I'd love to tell you more if I knew.
Yeah.
I'm kind of terrified about this because it's the one thing we don't have finished yet. Everything else is done. I have to finish that.
To finish it before it happens.
Yes.
That is awesome.
I've got people on the team helping find things. It'll be all right.
So at RPG Limit Break, we had mentioned that you guys ran Final Fantasy.
Yes.
Are there any more long-form games that you would really love to showcase some of the things that are going on that you don't get the opportunity at a Games Done Quick? Something that people should go to tasvideos.org and check out?
I mean, if you want to watch Final Fantasy 8 or 9 over the course of 8 or 9 hours, you can go see a TAS of that if you want to.
And there's some pretty interesting things happening in there.
There are. I would say long-form content that's kind of hard to show here. A lot of the content is on consoles that are hard to emulate. specifically PlayStation, disc-based consoles. And there's some great runs. I happen to really like, on the N64 side, this one can be shown, but it's long. The 120 stars on Super Mario 64. That TAS is still so incredible. And they're working on improvements even today. That one is still being worked on and worked over. There's just amazing new tech coming out of that. It's just a fun run. I really like seeing how they've blasted apart Ocarina of Time, but I kind of, in some ways, prefer earlier versions of it, obsoleted versions that are a little bit longer. They're maybe not the fastest strat, but they show off more of the game. And sometimes that's just more interesting for various reasons. But
the entertainment value, you got to have that, especially for something like games done quick.
The biggest thing that's happened is the advent of what's called libtas. So I am the president of the North Bay Linux Users Group. I'm predisposed to liking Linux, but this is especially nice because it's games that are running in Linux in a re-recording framework, although the rest of the community prefers different verbiage, but I like calling them re-recording frameworks. It's just a set of tools, task tools, around a PC game. There were previous things like this in Windows called Hourglass, but it was awful. It was built specifically for Cave Story. Adapting it to anything else was a terrible disaster.
Okay.
I mean a very, very awful experience. libtas finally makes PC tasking possible. So for games that have a PC port, we're starting to see some really good stuff. Things like Dust Force. And you might not have to go to TAS Videos to see that because I have a really good suspicion that we're going to submit that to AGDQ.
Nice.
2020 in Florida. I just have to figure out how to pay to get there.
Yeah.
Which is a very awkward topic. I'm about $15,000 in the hole from flying to all these GDQ type events.
Do you have a Patreon set up?
You know what I have is a donation link. We're talking about the community really quick. I represent TAS Videos as an ambassador, but in my position of having started the modern console verification at GDQ type events, in that role as kind of the leader of the TASBot community, we've really grown in very, very different and divergent ways from TAS Videos. A lot of it is our Discord server. I have a love-hate relationship with Discord. I'd love to be able to have more control over it, but a lot of gamers are there, so a lot of the conversations happen there. I don't want to just throw a random link out in the middle of a podcast.
Let's do this. We're at an hour 15, and I have a few other things that I do want to talk about, and I know that'll take a lot of time anyways. But before we get there, this would be a good opportunity. Where can people find you? Your Twitch channel, all of that stuff. Can you go ahead and plug them, make sure people know? I'll plug them
really quick, and then we'll come back at the end just to kind of tie it off. So the Discord is at, the main website for this whole thing is at tas.bot. It's amazing we got a .bot domain. We did. So you can go to https://tas.bot, tas.bot. We have a Discord server up. You can find the invite link at discord.tas.bot. We also have a lot of other random things. I'm not on Instagram. I'm looking for someone to take on doing that kind of social media. I'm not on Facebook.
Social media takes a lot of effort.
It does. We have 1,300 people on the Discord community. I do everything as my own name. So I am DwangoAC. It's DwangoAC on Twitch. I'm DwangoAC.
Dial-up wireless.
Yeah, you're catching on to this.
Yeah.
I was a moderator on the Denver Dwango server, dial-up wide area network gaming organization. And as a moderator on the Denver Dwango server, I was the username AC, and after that shut down, I was DwangoAC.
And about AC, sorry that we turned it off for the sound purposes. It is a little warm in here.
It's okay.
Yeah. So, and we're here at the Dogcast. You can find us on Twitter at HotDogcast and on Instagram. I'm personally Loaf of White Brad, mostly on Instagram. I have 12 Twitter followers now, though, so it's getting pretty serious. Finish the thought that you were on before. Did you want to?
Well, the only other thing I would say is on plugging things. I've found that between Twitch and YouTube, I get much better engagement on live streams, and I have one of the most complex live streams anywhere on Twitch. I was recently Twitch partnered, which helped a lot, and
congratulations.
A lot of the development work happens on Twitch. If you just want to watch what happens on the other side, if you don't want to see the sausage being made, go to YouTube. DwangoAC on YouTube, just look up TASBot on YouTube. That's where you'll find the highlights, the fun stuff. So it just depends on what kind of content you're looking for. As far as discussion in the team, discord.tas.bot is probably the best place for now, even though I am struggling a little bit with Discord, but and we do have a donate link off of there. But at the moment, I'm just trying to figure out how to raise money through other means, through increasing Twitch revenue and YouTube revenue. I've thought about Patreon in the past, but I don't want to be. It's tricky, right? I'm this figurehead that's making some small amount of money now through Twitch and YouTube from a community that put hours. I gave the example of 20,000 hours of content, of work went into the content for Celeste.
Mm-hmm.
It feels a little bit awkward. Even though I'm fully legal and using attribution and doing everything right, it does feel a little bit awkward profiting from it. But at the same time, I'm in the hole, so it's not too bad.
I personally would just advise you not to feel awkward. We want you in this community. We want you to be able to travel and to not have to be in the hole to showcase your amazing community. I don't think it would hurt. Just throw a Patreon up there. If anyone wants to throw you some money, I think that would be great.
Yeah, all I have now is a donate link. It's at donate.tasbot.
And go there and donate, folks. I reached out and got a few questions from some of the community. First, though, Tom, one of the hosts of our podcast, couldn't be here today. He wanted to know, what's the craziest/shittiest system you've ever attempted to emulate?
It was when we invalidated a 30-year long-standing Guinness World Record.
Are we talking about Dragster?
Yes, we're talking about Dragster.
OmniGamer's coming on later. I'm excited to talk to him about that.
Yes, I would love to be able to talk to him about that. OmniGamer did all of the hard work.
Yeah.
But with his input file, we were able, after a lot of jank, to prove that what OmniGamer said was true.
Yeah.
That on real hardware, it is only possible to get the 5.57. You can't get a 5. I'm forgetting the times now. 5.51. I think was the fake one.
Yeah. Yep. And 5.54 was what the company said was possible, but 5.57 what was actually possible.
Yeah. Now, I had a pretty. This is a couple years ago now. I had a pretty bad capture setup at the time. I have much better equipment now. By the way, if you ever get into any of this stuff, and you can attest to this, you just keep spending money. But
yeah,
I had to do it over again. I would do it differently. But we had a pretty janky setup. It was really, really hard to get the Commodore 64 to work because of the frame boundary. Remember how I said that there was no frame boundary, and we'd come back to that? This is that moment. We had to use a separate chip to detect the VSync signal on the TV. In other words, it's drawing on a CRT. We needed to detect when it got to the top edge so that we could lock to some kind of frame so that we could say, hey, board, start holding down the next frame's worth of input. When it would lock to the next frame, we'd switch and say, okay, this is the next frame of input that the game needs to hear. So we would hold down the buttons in the right order. Even then, we had a lot of noise. It was hard to detect when the console turned on. It would have a lot of voltage spikes. So we just had to do it a few times before we got it, but we got it. And we consistently could get the time that OmniGamer made, but never once got anything lower than that.
Okay. Major Victory asks, of all the games where tasking isn't viable or possible, which game would you most like to see tasked and why?
I think I would probably go with Breath of the Wild.
Oh, yeah, that'd be fun.
And it's not necessarily as impossible as you think. But we're doing it for a different reason.
AGDQ 2021.
Nope. We failed at AGDQ 2019. We actually submitted Breath of the Wild.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I'm glad it wasn't accepted because we were not nearly as ready as we thought we would be. Here's what we did do, though. And this is going to touch on a really big topic. It's actually a really, really big topic. Remember how I said that Speed Demo's archive was really upset at tool-assisted content, and tool-assisted content eventually became completely perfect? What do you do when you're halfway between those two communities? And what do you do if you're half-coordinated, or you're someone else who's using tools because you have limited mobility? What do you do where there's no place to accept your content?
What do you do?
Right now, nothing. I'm trying to fix that. One of the things I really want to see happen is making games like Breath of the Wild more accessible to these players. And one of the things that's a challenge is even beyond just the control, the human-to-computer interface, there's still the whole aspect of what you can actually ask of someone who does have limited mobility. I'll give you an example. If you're playing Breath of the Wild and you're about to get attacked by an enemy, there's a small frame or several frame window where you can dodge roll out of the way, which requires you're locked onto the enemy with one button, you're pressing a controller button in another direction, and you press a button on a specific frame or set of frames that causes you to roll. Then, after you've done that, you now need to let go and start attacking at a 10 hertz rate.
Okay.
You need to keep button mashing that button over and over again.
Yeah.
That's very demanding for someone who might not have all of their digits or might have the inability to move quickly. What we wanted to do was figure out a way to make that more accessible. So using TAS tools, we took the Xbox accessibility controller.
Yeah.
We connected that to a Linux laptop, used an Arduino to pretend to be a switch controller, and connected it to the switch, and did one more step, which was adding macro support on top of that line of data. So you could, with the accessibility controller, press a foot pedal or any other button combination you wanted to. Effectively made it a QuickTime event. If you timed it right, it would then execute the input for you. It would do the dodge roll. It would do the attacks for you.
Okay.
And you could use different combinations of macros in order to execute things that would otherwise be very difficult. Our goal being to find a way to enable people who just want to experience the story of a game be able to do that without having to worry about not being able to execute. And
that is fantastic.
We have this huge dream. I'm in contact with Able Gamer, who's a fantastic organizer. They're just a great group. They're fantastic people. We really want to take this to the next level of making this much more accessible, making a website where you can store all these macros. But there's some challenges. And the challenges are that we might have to meddle with the consoles to do it. To do it accurately, to do it with the level of precision we need, we might need to soft mod a Switch. And that leads to some very interesting legal stickiness. Because so far, everything I've talked to you about today has been talking mostly about NES and SNES, consoles that don't have any kind of encryption. So what we do with those when we take them over doesn't violate DMCA.
Mm-hmm.
But if we do that to a Switch, how do I keep someone from suing me?
You don't want that.
So there's... Just kind of throw this all in a big bucket here. I'm starting a specific low-income, limited liability company, a social benefit corporation company to hold the assets of TASBot, to hold physically him, his replay devices, and to be in a place where if we do something at an event that a specific company doesn't like, just like how GeoHot was sued by Sony for hacking the PlayStation 3, we want to have some way to have a protection, some kind of protection, so that it's the company that gets sued rather than any of us individually. We don't want to lose our homes just because we're providing entertainment.
TASBot's a troublesome little device.
It would be in pretty poor taste for someone to sue us for doing things that raise money for charity, but...
Or if you're trying to help able gamers.
Exactly.
That's the best thing you could be...
Right.
Best community you could be reaching out to.
It's a fantastic community, but by doing this, we might end up in a situation where we modify a Switch in a way Nintendo doesn't like, and they come after us.
And I'm sure they wouldn't be happy with an Xbox controller plugged into there.
Right. One other quick note on this. The other thing we're doing here is providing survivorship. I've noticed a lot of communities built around a single individual, and when that individual dies or leaves in some way, it's often the case that the community just fractures or falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want that to happen. I don't want to be the only person that ever has TASBot. I want to build a legacy that continues to champion the cause of digital preservation, of taking what we remember from our childhoods, no matter whose childhood it is, and preserving it and doing interesting forms of art with it, of taking what was there before and doing something new and fascinating with it. This is bigger than me as a person. So one of the biggest reasons to form a company around TASBot isn't greed. I don't intend to ever make any money off of it or even really open a bank account. It's to have a survivorship clause so that the assets are passed on to another group, someone after me in case I die. Or, let's be honest, some communities have leaders that have done really stupid things and they needed to be removed.
Yeah.
I hope to never be that person. I'm trying to be above reproach in all things, but I don't want this to fall apart because of my ineptitude or death.
Yeah. Dude, you're doing some excellent work.
I'm passionate about it, too.
I've learned a lot today. I had a couple other questions. They were posted in binary and hexadecimal from some people. When you ask, do you have any questions for TASBot? People want to send things about, well, Fetto Cheese asks about what are your plans to take over the world? And Duffadash asks, how do you feel?
So TASBot has a little bit of interesting canon around him. Some of it is a little unusual.
Well, he used to have a thing for the GDQ monitor.
Yes, and that was even something we did at the Brain Age run in 2016. We specifically drew art of him trying to hand her flowers, which was so cute.
Very cute.
And then GDQ monitor sort of went dormant, and that was sad. And then a lot of other people decided that they wanted to be with TASBot too, and they all claimed him on their own, and then it became canon that he was poly in order to solve the problem of who had him.
Yeah, and I guess you mentioned that he's been suffering from ED.
Oh yes, that was a very big problem earlier this week. So you see, this is a Rob robot built in the 1980s as a way to act as a Trojan horse into the video game market, which at the time was saturated by really awful Atari games that had collapsed, and no retailer wanted to allow a video game console. So they released it as the Nintendo Entertainment System, and this guy was their piece de resistance. It allowed them to sell it in the toy section because it was an entertainment system. You were playing with a robot, you see.
Yes.
So a robotic operating buddy. But let's be honest, he's 1986.
He's getting old.
He's getting old.
It's not staying up like it used to.
After several years of being handled at GDQ events, he had some electromechanical dysfunction, and it was at the point where he would just droop. He would just he couldn't keep it up. His ED was just too advanced. I was able to get some help with the World 9 crew to do some repairs to his gears, but ultimately, we can't keep using this Rob. And this is a sad day, but have no fear. Just like Wintergotten with Marble Machine X, we will rebuild him. We will make him stronger, better, bigger. He will still be TASBot, but he will also not be IP infringing.
Was that ever been an issue?
Well, I have met people who work at Nintendo and say that they really like what I'm doing, but I've also seen some really scary things happening from Nintendo's legal team. So at a certain point, I really think it's necessary to move on from Rob as much as I love him. When we rebuild him, we'll keep all of the same elements that make him lovable. One of the things is, I don't know if you've actually picked him up. He has a warmth to him. He's built out of very smooth, wonderful plastic, very well built considering the age. And when you grab him, it's not a cold piece of aluminum.
No.
But let's also be honest, it's a Lego box wrapped around arms.
Yes. It's better than a shoebox, though, right?
Yes. And you know what? It is a mascot. We use his name all the time. There's a lot of other humans, myself included.
He has his own badge.
Yes.
Yes,
he does.
Awesome.
But ultimately, it's a Rob. This is going to make a hideous noise.
Oh, he's getting fancy.
Yes. I didn't say he's perfect.
It's okay, buddy. We still like you.
And he'll stop in a sec.
Well, do you have anything you'd like to say to our
loud.
Anything to say to our viewers before we take off?
I would say that this particular interview has covered a lot of ground. There's no possible way to cover all of the minutia. This just scratched the surface.
I've learned so much today, and I actually did. I followed almost everything you were saying, which I'm surprised. So you did a great job explaining it.
Good.
But there is a lot more.
There's a lot more. There's a couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, while the rate of new improvements in old games is slowing down, the advent of tools for things like libtas are making tool-assisted speedruns of modern games, really good modern games, possible. Games that are like Celeste, games like Dust Force, games like SteamWorld Dig 2, which we'll be showing at Europe. Before this, I don't know when this is going to air, but we will be...
Probably about a week.
Okay, we'll be taking TASBot to ESA, and he'll be playing SteamWorld Dig 2, a PC game based on Linux, or running in Linux. And that's a whole new vista of games to play and to mess with. The TASVideos community can sometimes come across as elitist. There are some graybeards even in that community.
Oh, yeah.
But have no fear. We're actually really friendly folks there. So if you come to TASVideos, you can make your own tool-assisted speedruns. If that's not your speed, you can just watch the content. I had to do that.
I loved it.
If you want to do a binge night of watching content, go to TAS.bot, We have the videos linked from GDQ VODs in particular. We might make our own version of it, but they did such a good job, there was no point reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
So they're all listed there. There's some really fantastic content. I'm putting out new content allegedly on a weekly basis. It doesn't work that way, but if you want to get involved in helping us, we need all kinds of different things. I'm looking for a media manager for Instagram and someone to take on Facebook. I've personally never once had a Facebook account. I don't know anything about it.
That's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's not my thing. We don't have Snapchat. We don't have any of these new things. But we do have Mr. TASBot on Twitter, but I need a manager to handle Twitter.
TASBot should have a Tinder dating app. Maybe not. You gave me a funny look there. He could be really popular.
Given that he's already allegedly by canon poly, that could end really badly.
That could be really funny.
Can I use foul language on this?
Fuck, dude.
Okay. I'm really concerned about something. It's called teledildonics.
Okay.
Anyway.
No, what is teledildonics?
Exactly what it sounds like.
And on that note.
But if you want to get involved, we don't really delve into that too much. If you go to discord.tas.bot in particular, we're always looking for new people to augment the community because it's really easy to burn out. And I've lost really good people. I've lost friends in sad ways because of burnout, and I don't want to see that. So one of the things that you might notice is that after AGDQ 2017, for the most part, one minor blip, we've generally scoped down what we've done and tried to focus on quality over quantity. We've tried to do things that are focused on entertainment rather than technical acumen. We're really framing ourselves as entertainers, as people who present art. And it still takes a lot of resources to put all that together. So we would love to have people in the community.
Everyone, pay attention. Listen to what he's saying. If you can help, you should get out there and try. If you can donate, go out there. If nothing else, go to tasvideos.org, go to tas.bot. And if you're not familiar with what he's doing, it is phenomenal and definitely worth your time. Dwango, this has been a journey.
It has. A very long and winding one.
I feel smarter. I was hungover when we started, and now I'm feeling ready to at least get out in the world a little bit. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for teaching me all these things. I'm excited for the runs today, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Everyone, we'll see you get back out there to GDQ. Thank you so much.